This is a recording from Reunions Weekend 2009 at the University of Virginia, made possible by the university's Office of Engagement. In pre-kindergarten classrooms across the United States, toddlers are learning and are getting ready for kindergarten. Dr. Jason Downer, senior research scientist at the Center for Advanced Study of Teaching and Learning, described the long-term benefits of high-quality pre-kindergarten education. He showed how an investment in such education can result in higher lifetime wages, lower rates of disability assistance, and many more self-reliant contributing members of our community.
And thanks everybody for coming early on such a beautiful day. We'll try not to keep you in here too long. And thanks for bringing the young ones along too. Perfect session for them. So I am here to tell you a little bit about the work that Bob Pianz and I and a number of our colleagues have been doing over the last few years and will be doing into the next couple years around how to try and give young children a head start on learning, and learning not just in the sense of knowing your ABCs and language development, but also social development and emotional development. And specifically I'm going to talk about sort of thinking about the transition to school and not just a 4-year-old becoming a 5-year-old and getting into the K through 12 system, but even think about it as a child who's in daycare, childcare, early preschool, thinking already about how are we helping them to get ready to go into the K through 12 system. And a big piece that I'll focus on, and that we've done some research on, is how important teachers are, and particularly how they interact with the kids. As early as early daycare and quite honestly up into college classrooms. You probably all had lots of interactions even with college teachers and know that how they relate to you, how they implement their lesson plans makes a big difference in whether you care about what they're talking about, whether you learn it. So it really spans the whole learning continuum. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. We're a small group, okay? So if you got a question as I'm going, just raise your hand, pop up, let me know, and I'm happy to slow down and talk about it as we go. But I'll also leave time for questions at the end. So why should we pay attention to these early years? I've had to give less and less of a big pitch on this recently because there's been a lot of stuff in the media, a lot of funding at the state and federal level focused on young kids. And a lot of this is based on the fact that there's been a lot of research that looks at children early on and follows them into adulthood. And what we can see is that how children are doing early heavily predicts how they do later in terms of employment, in terms of whether or not they're contributing as successful citizens in the U.S. And what we've also discovered is there have been some studies of early preschool and daycare experiences that show that if you intervene early on, you get a lot of payback down the road. Actually, a couple of years ago, James Heckman, who's an economist, actually won the Nobel Prize. And he won the Nobel Prize around this idea that investing dollars early in 2-, 3-, 4-year-olds is going to pay off greater dividends down the road than, say, waiting until high school to change class size. Or so not that not all of these things aren't very important, but that you get more bang for your buck if you're really paying attention to helping kids grow early. Unfortunately, some other things that have come up is to show that our children make a lot of transitions early on. They may go from one child care to the next, or from a more daycare arrangement to a more school-focused preschool, and then again to kindergarten. And these discontinuities during the transitions can be a real challenge, to the regulatory abilities of young ones. So again, it's a time where there's a lot of change going on. So it makes sense to pay attention to trying to create connections and relationships that can support kids as they're making a lot of these changes early. Just to highlight some of the discontinuities I'm talking about. So there are a lot of changes in what's expected of kids. From preschool to kindergarten, even from classroom to classroom around what sort of demands, what are the expectations for sitting and doing work by yourself, for waiting in line to go to the bathroom or to brush your teeth. There are a lot of differences across things, and these become more formalized over time. And so this is a big kind of misalignment between earlier care environments and later educational environments. the complexity of the social setting also changes. So you think about a preschool where children are often, there's only a couple of classrooms, maybe at most. Some family daycares, there's just one place, there's one set of kids. You move into a school environment where you have lots of classrooms, children who are spread out much more in age. You have recess and you have lunchtime in which they sort of mix everybody up, and it's a much more complex social environment that, again, can be a challenge for young kids. There also tends to be a little bit less connection between teachers and schools and families themselves as children move through that early childhood period. Another thing that's changing. And then it's also been documented that the actual time that a child gets one-on-one with teachers tends to start declining as they hit K through 12. There are a lot of changes happening for kids, and so we have to think about what are the ways that we can create connections and continuity for them. So during these changes, they have a sense that somebody's holding their hand and that they're going to successfully make their way into the K through 12 system. Bob and some others did some research a number of years ago on transition practices, which is, what are schools doing to try to help during this time to help kids make this leap. And some of the most common things that kindergarten teachers reported doing, a lot of them said that they were talking with parents once school got started. Okay, so school's going on, and maybe a conference happens or a phone call. Maybe a letter gets sent home that says, make sure that this happens for my classroom. And there's oftentimes this big open house. But you might notice that a lot of those say after school starts, right? Things that happen far less often are more personalized than earlier things. So schools have had a hard time reaching back and starting a little bit earlier, right? So making a phone call or a visit ahead of school starting. Doing something that's going to create a more seamless connection between families and schools. And so what we're finding is that a lot of times you're seeing more generic context between schools. And when I say school, I mean largely the elementary schools and families. And between schools and early care environments like a preschool or a daycare. And these things happen after school. So time and time again, we've been hearing parents say, get us the information early, talk to us early, ask me about my child, get to know the child, so that it'll be a seamless transition. The other theme here is that oftentimes the transition stuff is happening at schools. Schools sometimes don't do a great job of moving their way out into the community and meeting families where they're at. And so this is another thing that's not happening a good deal. So largely the take-home point is that schools are trying, but a lot of their communication efforts to create this link so that children make a successful transition has happened a little bit too late. It's not always as personal as families are looking for. And it's just not quite enough. It's not comprehensive enough. There are a couple of reasons for this, and we've talked with folks and think that one of it is that schools are largely thinking about the transition for kids as being, in some ways, that the child is responsible in a lot of ways for making that leap. So the child has a lot of skills that they're developing in homes as they're growing up and in preschool, and that they're then supposed to just take those skills with them into the next environment, into kindergarten, for instance. So in that regard, the responsibility falls on the child to make this leap, right? But we know that the child's not alone in this world and that there's a lot going on around them that's either going to serve as a barrier to them making a successful transition and learning, or that could be very supportive. So I'd like you to think more about the child being in this system where they're relating to people and settings all the time. And those people can really be a support, and they typically tend to stay with them over time. So how are there ways that we can create some continuity from early years, preschool, daycare, into the K through 12 system in these connections, right? So the relationship between families and teachers, which may look a certain way in preschool but then changes. How can we think about ways to keep those connections stable over time? So there are lots of places to focus on here. I'll talk about a couple of them, then I'm going to go in a little deeper on one in particular. So one thing is to try to think about ready schools. And when I say ready schools, I mean that schools try to take a little bit more responsibility for reaching backward towards families before they get to them. So coming out into the community and not just thinking that they have to wait until children show up on the doorstep for kindergarten and that's when it all starts, right? But to try to start a little bit earlier. Another big piece is that helping to support healthy kids early on is not just about schools and families. It's about a community at large. So how can the community members kind of get together and rally around this? A big one is kindergarten registration sometimes is a real mess in some communities. So how can you get the word out? Are there grocery stores that can post flyers? Can you get libraries on board? Can you get pediatricians that are talking with families who they know have kids who are about to head into that 5-year-old range? What are ways that we can get communities to also be supportive? Families, what are ways that schools can help families be involved, either in knowing something about what that child's going to experience at school or what things could be happening at home that would align well with what teachers will expect of kids when they show up in school. And then the other link is preschools and childcare. So there has been sort of a disconnect between the early childhood world and the K through 12 world in that there are sort of different curricula, there are sometimes different expectations, different experiences, and that can be a little bit shocking for kids as they move from one to the other, right? Because they hear school, and then they move into kindergarten, and that school experience may be very different for them. So how can we get preschools, kindergartens talking to each other so they don't have to look the same? But can they be talking to each other so they can at least be helping kids make that transition a little smoother? So a big part of that, and a lot of the work that we do at Castle that Jay mentioned, the Research Center, is focused on an aspect of trying to create continuity of classroom experiences for kids. And it's all focused on the fact that a central piece of these classrooms are teachers and what they do, how they set up their classrooms, and how they interact with their kids. And if we can focus on that, and trying to make sure that that stays of high quality and consistent over time, that children are going to benefit from that. There's lots of things that contribute to teachers making a positive experience for kids. Some folks have looked at qualifications. Should we make sure that all teachers have a certain type of degree or a certain background? How much experience do teachers need to provide really high quality experiences for kids? Is it many, many years? Can we do something to help early career teachers be doing the same thing and as positive as teachers who've been around for a while? And our focus has sort of shifted away from those first two things and thought, regardless of those sorts of things lead to a teacher to do certain things in the classroom. And so our focus has been more on how are teachers interacting with students from early on till later in school. What are the sort of relationships that they're building with their students and the kids? How are they implementing the activities around instruction? And it's really those little interactions that happen every second in a classroom that really makes the difference to develop healthy children. So you can think about all these things over on the left that are possible contributions to students' learning and to teachers being satisfied with their jobs. But what I'm going to propose and talk to you a little bit about is that those things really only matter as much as they change how teachers and students are interacting with each other in the classroom. And that's really how we end up with kids learning and developing socially. And a big piece that we're focused on from an education school, of course, is the teacher and how the teacher can interact in these ways to lead to these outcomes. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's actually happening out there in classrooms, and this covers a couple of studies that go from daycare, where kids are as young as 6 months, all the way up into early elementary school. There are these few longitudinal studies. We're talking about basically about 1,000 different settings here that cross that time period. You're not going to find any other information that has this sort of systematic observations where we sent people into these settings and made ratings of what was going on. I also want to point out that all these teachers are fully credentialed and certified. So, teachers across the country, we have a lot of range in this, especially in early childhood. And these teachers in particular were certified. So some of what we find out is that a lot of the interactions or the activities that are happening in classrooms are either whole group, which would be sort of like this, kind of a lecture style with a teacher having a big group of students in front of her. Or, especially in elementary school, individual seat work, which is more sort of the worksheet, kind of rote type of activities. Okay, those really predominate what happens in classrooms around interactions and activities. There's actually shockingly little real interactions between individual students and the teacher. So much more often they're happening like this, and they're not happening where I would be talking kind of one-on-one and interacting with a particular student. This probably doesn't come as any surprise. In terms of content in these early years, alphabet knowledge, early literacy, early language development is a heavy, heavy focus in these classrooms. And an important thing to know is that there's a lot of variation here. So a child from one year to the next has very little promise that they'll remain in a classroom that looks the same as it did the year before. In fact, as they get into later elementary school and they start switching classrooms throughout the day, there's also very little promise that going from Mrs. X's classroom to Mr. Y's will feel very similar to them. In fact, they're going to be quite different, regardless of content, but just the way that people are interacting with each other are going to look very different. There's a lot of change across these things. And even more important to point out is that these educational opportunities are very uneven in terms of, especially kids who are coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. They tend to select into classrooms that are of lower quality interactions than those who are coming from families that are better off. So those kids that are in most need of some of these high-quality experiences aren't getting them. So our focus has shifted then towards thinking about how do we observe interactions between teachers and students. And there's an instrument called the class that Bob and several have developed that looks specifically at what teachers do to promote academic learning and social learning. And they're organized into three broad areas, which I'll talk to you about in a second. The first one is emotionally supportive interactions. So these are things like creating a really warm climate where kids are enjoying learning, where there's a lot of smiling going on, where the teacher and the students are connected to each other. They have a relationship. Teachers notice when individual children need something different than the whole class, and they respond in that sort of way. They provide opportunities for kids to be able to share their own perspectives and to be somewhat autonomous in the classroom, in addition to following the lead of the teacher. Then we've got another set of interactions that we look at, which is called sort of organizational support, or how the classroom's managed. And this is, supports the kids so that they can regulate their behavior, to make sure that they're staying focused and on task and engaged in an activity that's going to help them to develop. And then the final piece is a really important piece, which is these instructional supports. And this is the type of questions that teachers ask, the type of feedback, the type of modeling of language they give that helps students to take the material they're learning and actually really think about it, grapple with it, even at a 3- and 4-year-old, to be thinking about what's being presented to them and understand it. So not just learning facts, not just learning what the letter A looks like, capital and lowercase, but knowing how to use it, being able to compare and contrast shapes, really actually getting to think about things. So we went into all these classrooms. What does this look like? Well, on a scale from 1 to 7, with 7 being high, a classroom you'd really want your child to be in. Okay. By and large, most classrooms fall under that little bump there. Okay, so the majority of classrooms are somewhat high up on the scale in terms of emotional support, a little bit under a 5. Same thing with organizational support. Classrooms are generally pretty organized across the country, but the shocking thing is that in terms of these thought-provoking questions, modeling of language, the things that are really helping drive learning are not happening that often in classrooms. And this doesn't matter whether it's a daycare, preschool, or even later elementary. This is a similar pattern that you're seeing. So you might ask, does this really matter? And so we've also looked at how these things relate to children's development. And we've provided some study designs so that we take out of the picture everything else that might contribute to children's development, everything that families are doing that are so important, other things that are happening, things about the child, and then we specifically look at how these interactions contribute to changes in development. What we see is somewhat small effects, which isn't surprising because we know how important families are and how some of the characteristics that children bring to classrooms really play a large role in what they learn. But we do see these small effects, and these are small effects within a year that can be compounded over time, meaning that small effect 1 year, another year, together, each little bit is a foundation that child builds on moving forward. There's also much stronger effects of the types of interactions I've been talking about for certain groups of kids. So those kids that we might think of as at risk for having difficulty in school and later on. So those coming from less advantaged families, those who show early adjustment problems for whatever reason early in school are really benefiting a lot from these classrooms that are higher in the quality of their interactions. So in fact, for those kids, about half of the achievement gap in a year can be closed if they're in a really highly supportive environment. Okay? So you can think about it, that's just 1 year. Now I mentioned that it's very hard for kids to find themselves in that environment for multiple years in a row. But we as an education system haven't figured out how to do that very well yet. But if you can get a child in a classroom like that, it's going to close the gap. Just to give you an example, the types of things these are related to, see emotional support there is related to changes during preschool and things like social skills, like being assertive, being able to ask for what you want, a reduction in problem behaviors, which could be a lot of things. It could be clinginess, it could be minor kinds of aggression. Then the instructionally supportive interactions leads to a lot of the academic development that you'd be looking for in preschool language. Kids talking, being able to understand talk, and early literacy in math. So bear with me on this. I'm going to try to walk you through this complicated graph here. So over on the left, those are scores on an academic achievement test. Okay, the higher the better. And on the bottom, we're looking at groups of kids who are in very low instructionally supportive classrooms, moderately, and high. And the light-colored bars are kids who come from families that are pretty well off socioeconomically. So there's not really any difference for those kids coming from a family background that's pretty high SES in terms of what the classroom brings. But when you look at kids who are coming who need more support, they essentially, as the classroom supports grow, their achievement basically looks or parallels the achievement of kids who are coming from families that have a lot more supports for them. So basically what this is showing is those kids who are at risk, if you can make sure that they get these really highly supportive classroom experiences, they're going to achieve or learn at the same rate as those kids who have benefited from more support prior to getting into that classroom. So just to show you, there's the same pattern with a different risk variable. So kids who come in and their kindergarten teacher says they're having some trouble adjusting to the classroom, they too, if they're in a really highly emotionally supportive classroom, are able to achieve similarly to those kids who don't have any adjustment problems heading into school. So I put these up here just to show you how important these types of interactions are in classrooms, particularly for those kids who may be at risk for struggling early on. So what's the implications of this for early childhood and then up into elementary school and beyond? One of it is, let's focus the regulation and training for teachers on these types of interactions, right? So if we're pushing standards, and there's a big push in the country right now from Obama and everyone else to try to provide some standards, more standards for teachers and measures of what they're doing. And if we're going to do that, it makes a lot of sense to focus on those things that are helping children learn. And it appears that it's these interactions. we think the implications are to try to work on those instructional interactions that are really low on the scale. There's a lot of room for improvement there, and try to move them up. So we've been working on trying to develop some training and support of teachers that directly addresses these interactions. And to really systematically and scientifically use standardized observations to give feedback to teachers about what they're doing and to help them build their practice. So I actually saw, I think it was in the New York Times, but it was talking about the DC public schools. There's a lot of things out there about how can we incentivize teachers to do the things that help students learn. And one of them is to pay folks more. And they're starting a charter school where I think the average pay for teachers is $125K a year. And they're looking to attract folks who wouldn't normally teach in a public school. So you can do that, right? And try to incentivize people to teach. But we'd like to propose that should be tied somehow to these interactions that we know are important, right? Not just to a degree that a teacher brings into the classroom or credentials, but also, what are things that are happening in there so that we know that students are learning. It's different in different places. I know, there are sort of alternative certification programs where they'll try to pull folks like out of engineering to teach physics or math. There's some folks might know Teach for America, which draws from all kinds of disciplines across campuses to try to get college students to come in and to come into teaching who might not normally do that. So we've identified that these interactions are important in classrooms. And so what do we do to make sure they happen? There's lots of things over on the left we can do. We can try to create curriculum that lead to these interactions. What we're doing is mostly focusing on professional development and training. And Jay mentioned that we're working on this thing called My Teaching Partner. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of it. What we're doing is working with preschool teachers across the country. And we're using the class, which is this thing that talks about the interactions that are important, as the basis for providing them with feedback. And the goal is to help teachers to be really good at observing what they do in the classroom outside of the moment. So it involves videotape, and it involves consultation over time with a consultant that works with them. There are a couple things that they get access to. One is we have this large library of videos from real classrooms that shows teachers interacting with kids in really positive, high-quality ways. And so we make this available to the teachers so that they can go and see lots of other teachers with different sets of kids doing these types of interactions to try to draw from that, to both get good at looking at it and understanding what these things are and then using it for their own practice. But the key piece that we're doing, which is really exciting, and we're not the only ones, there's a lot of this consultation and coaching happening across the country, where a teacher actually has a videotape in the classroom and videos what she's doing during a lesson. And this can be in preschool, all the way up, and we have folks doing this in high schools now. Then he or she has a consultant who edits this down and then has the teacher watch very short aspects of their interactions with kids and think about what are you doing here that's helping those children learn in this moment. They post this all on a secure online interface. The teacher reviews these, responds to some of the questions and prompts that the consultant made, and then they have a conference which they talk about it. And so it's all focused, again, on these types of interactions that we know help children learn. And it's giving teachers support, not in a critical way, not in an evaluative way, but in a way that they can sort of step outside of their daily practice and really look at and understand what they're doing with the kids and what makes a difference, and to build on that over time. And this happens, throughout the school year. It's not a one-and-done kind of a thing.
At this point, a member of the audience observed that teachers who do not have the ability to foster positive interactions could potentially change a child's whole being.
Sure. No, it's true that there are certain aspects of these interactions that are a real challenge for certain teachers. And so, what happens is that a consultant works very closely to build a trusting relationship with the teacher. So sometimes they don't tackle those real tough ones first. Sometimes they'll tackle something that's a strength of the teacher and to really bolster it and make sure that he or she recognizes that and does it even more. And then as they're more comfortable with the videotaping and having this sort of interaction over time with the consultant, they can start to tackle some of those things that might be challenging. And I can tell you that there are a lot of folks who say, I'm never going to do this with you, and very much buy in and really enjoy it. So it's and what I'll show you here is we actually have some results that say it actually works. So with a large group of teachers, we gave some of them only access to those videos that I showed you. And throughout the year, their sensitivity basically stayed the same, even went down a little bit. But those who got this one-on-one consultation throughout the year made gains in how sensitive they were responding to their kids, which is one of those things you might think is like a personality characteristic that would be difficult to alter, but in fact is not. And this type of process helps teachers to become more confident, because even the things they're doing well, a lot of teachers aren't recognizing it because they're not getting a lot of feedback about it. So this allows them to get that feedback. Yeah, and build off of a strength. We're seeing those same kind of gains in a lot of different types of interactions. And we're also showing that kids in these classrooms in the early years are making gains in early literacy outcomes and social outcomes. And then later, there's also a project going on in middle and high school. They're showing that the students in those classrooms are looking a little more motivated and engaged in classrooms where their teachers are getting this kind of support. Okay? Another thing with the middle and high school teachers is that they seem to be more satisfied with their job, more motivated, and feel like a sense that they're part of something bigger and not just isolated, which a lot of teachers report. So I'm going to wrap up so you can ask questions you might have. The real take-home here is that a key to children doing well, starting early on and then into elementary school, is that school is an effective piece, and the important part of it is these interactions in the classroom. So, we encourage parents to get into classrooms and see what's actually happening there. Find out how teachers are interacting with kids, because these things, you can see these things happening. We have this measure that you can go in and describe them and quantify them in a way. And the most exciting part is that it looks like you can support and change these things too. And so we're attempting to try to do that through some of Castle's work, both in Virginia and across the country, and are excited to see that this type of coaching, consultation, and support to teachers seems to be spreading, and more funding being available for it. So.
An audience member next asked how Downer and his team find and train the consultants they work with.
Yeah, we've trained folks so it's a pretty intensive training experience to be a consultant. People usually have had experience in the classroom in some way, shape, or form, but sometimes they've just finished being a center director. They've been a teacher at a preschool, but they kind of worked up the ladder. They're center director, and and then they've decided they wanted to do something different. We had folks with a speech and language degree. We've had folks who are clinical psychologists. So we've trained a number of different people who've been successful in that role, but it's not easy because it's sort of a different way of thinking about teaching too. It's not focused on the curriculum or the lesson plans as much. It's taking those and what do you do with them when you start talking with your kids about them, right? So it's a little different twist than some folks are used to in providing support to teachers.
The next question was about accountability and whether or not Downer and his team could measure the effects of positive interactions on test scores throughout a child's life.
Yeah, we have, and it's relatively early, and so our work has done that. Some other folks at different universities who have a slightly different way of doing this coaching, but they've also found positive benefits for kids. I know, particularly in early childhood, but then I showed some of that stuff in middle school and high school. We're actually working with a very large group with some Gates Foundation money coming up to look at these types of things to answer that exact question, but for high school and all the different content areas. So math, I think history, some of the big areas. So the point really is to try to think about how to look at these interactions rather than just the student outcomes, because it's the interactions that lead to those things. And there are a lot of pitfalls for holding teachers accountable just to how students are learning, because each classroom is different. It's hard to measure that at a classroom level. Yeah, so we're trying to use science to create some information that says this, focusing on what teachers are doing makes a lot of sense for dollars, right? And dollars have also been thrown a lot at just helping teachers get credentialed, but a lot of times the credentialing is focused on different things and not necessarily focused on helping teachers to learn better how to interact with their students. It may be focused on other aspects of their job, which may or may not be related to students doing better.
The next question dealt with the effects of budget cuts. Are programs to improve the performance of early childhood educators vulnerable to the downturn in the economy?
It's a good question. I think there are a lot of avenues towards it. One is that I was somewhat really struck by how big of a budget some school districts have for what they would call teacher professional development. A lot of which is typically used for in-service dates, where they'll bring in somebody to talk about a particular subject. So there may be some ways, if this was made a priority in a school district, that some of those dollars that are already there, might be able to be used in different ways. Yeah, so that's one thing, but not everybody has those dollars. I do think it gets driven by policy. So policy either at the state level or the federal level about what is it that we're wanting to see in these classrooms in these schools, and then that's where the money flows. Right? Yeah. Because even if it's a small pot of money, where is that pot of money, going? And we think it should be evidence-based. That it should be based on what research is showing us from real classrooms.
And a follow-up question related to the economy. One response to budget cuts is to increase class size. Is the ability of teachers to encourage positive interactions decreased when the student-to-teacher ratio is increased?
I haven't looked at that yet. A lot of the preschools we've been in, like for instance, we were in the state-funded preschool in Virginia, and they have a flat number, or they have, which is 16. So we weren't really able to look at variation in that, but I think as we get up into elementary and middle and high, we should. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.